They'd been 16 years old when their teacher disappeared. 42 students on a charter bus watching Ms. Patterson walk toward a rest area building on a crisp October afternoon in 1979. She'd left a note promising to return in 5 minutes. She never came back. Those students grew up haunted by that impossibility. How does someone vanish in 5 minutes from a rest stop with dozens of witnesses nearby? They graduated, went to college, started careers and families. But they never forgot Ms. Patterson, the history teacher who'd made learning exciting, who'd organized the field trip to historical sites across Wisconsin, who'd disappeared while 42 pairs of eyes should have been watching. In their 30s, several formed an unofficial committee dedicated to solving the case. They hired private investigators with pooled money. They organized annual gatherings to share information and theories. They maintained a website documenting everything known about October 14, 1979. In their 40s, they lobbied law enforcement to reopen the investigation, to use modern forensics, to treat Ms. Patterson's disappearance with the urgency it deserved. And in 2021, when they were in their late 50s, successful professionals, parents, grandparents themselves, one of them discovered something that finally answered the question they'd been asking for 42 years. But the answer came from an impossible source, his grandfather's secret journal, hidden in an attic, containing a confession to a murder nobody had suspected was murder. The student would have to choose between family loyalty and justice, between protecting the grandfather who'd raised him and honoring the teacher who'd vanished when he was 16. It was no choice at all. Truth mattered more than blood. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of how a beloved teacher vanished in front of 42 witnesses, how her students spent their entire adult lives searching for answers, and how a journal hidden in an attic finally revealed a truth so devastating that it forced a man to choose between family loyalty and justice. Before diving into what happened on October 14, 1979, and the 42-year search that followed, viewers are encouraged to subscribe to channels exploring cases where dedication triumphed over time, where evidence survived in unexpected places, and where truth eventually emerged no matter how carefully it had been hidden. The story of Ms. Patterson and her students demonstrates that some mysteries can be solved through sheer refusal to give up. Now, a question for viewers. Where are you watching from today? Comments sharing locations help connect people across different places, all united by the belief that every missing person deserves someone who refuses to forget them. October 14, 1979, started like any second day of a school field trip. Students tired from the previous day's activities but still engaged, excited about what came next. The charter bus had departed from the budget motel in Prairie du Chien around 9 a.m., heading northeast toward Madison, where students would tour the state capitol building. Sarah Patterson sat near the front of the bus, reviewing her notes for the capitol tour, occasionally turning around to check on students and make sure everyone was behaving. The parent chaperones, Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Garcia, sat toward the back, keeping watch, but mostly letting the 29-year-old teacher handle the group she knew so well. The students, 42 junior-year history students from Jefferson High School, represented a cross-section of rural Wisconsin teenage life in the late 1970s. Farm kids who'd wake at dawn to help with chores before school. Town kids whose parents worked at the local canning factory or paper mill. A few whose families had money doctors, lawyers, business owners. Most came from working-class backgrounds, where a 3-day field trip represented a significant expense their parents had scrimped to afford. They took the trip seriously, understood it was an opportunity not everyone got. Sarah Patterson had organized everything meticulously. She'd submitted detailed lesson plans showing how each site connected to curriculum requirements. She'd arranged transportation, secured hotel rooms, coordinated with each location they'd visit. She'd sent permission slips home weeks in advance, held a parent meeting to explain the trip's educational value, even fundraised to help students whose families genuinely couldn't afford the costs. This wasn't just a field trip. This was Sarah demonstrating what passionate teaching looked like, going beyond textbooks and lectures to give students experiences they'd remember decades later. The bus made good time through southwestern Wisconsin's rolling countryside. Students chatted, listened to portable radios, worked on assignments Sarah had given them about Fort Crawford, which they'd toured the previous day. Around 2:15 p.m., the bus driver, a man named Tom Wilson, who regularly drove for Jefferson High events, noticed his fuel gauge was getting low. He mentioned to Sarah that he'd need to stop soon, maybe at the next rest area, to stretch everyone's legs and grab coffee for himself. Highway 35, rest area, appeared about 15 minutes later. A modest facility consisting of a small visitor center building, separate men's and women's restrooms, a few picnic tables scattered across a lawn area, and a parking lot that could accommodate maybe 20 vehicles. The rest area sat surrounded by dense Wisconsin forest, miles from the nearest town, primarily serving travelers on the rural highway connecting smaller communities. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, the parking lot held only 3 other vehicles: a family station wagon, a pickup truck, and a sedan with Illinois plates. Tom Wilson pulled the charter bus into a space near the visitor center and killed the engine. He turned to Sarah. "Bathroom break? 15 minutes enough?" Sarah nodded, then stood and addressed her students. "Okay, everyone, quick rest stop. You can use the restrooms, stretch your legs, but stay where I can see you. We need to be back on the bus in 15 minutes because we've got a schedule to keep." Students filed off the bus in the orderly fashion Sarah demanded. No pushing, no rushing, single file. The parent chaperones went with them, herding the group toward the bathroom buildings. Sarah remained on the bus for a moment, gathering her things. She pulled a small notebook from her bag and scribbled something, tore out the page, and placed it on the bus dashboard where Tom would see it. Then she grabbed her jacket, a brown corduroy coat she'd been wearing all trip, and stepped off the bus. Tom Wilson, preparing to walk to the visitor center himself to get that coffee he'd been thinking about, glanced at the note Sarah had left. Written in her neat teacher handwriting, it said simply, "Back in 5 minutes. Stay on the bus, Ms. Patterson." Tom shrugged. Teachers had their reasons for doing things. Maybe she needed to check something at the visitor center, get a map, use a phone to call the hotel in Madison and confirm their reservation. He locked the bus and headed toward the restrooms himself, leaving Sarah's note where she'd placed it. Students scattered across the rest area. Some used the bathrooms, others gathered at picnic tables, smoking cigarettes they'd sneak, despite school rules prohibiting it. A few wandered toward the edge of the parking lot where the forest started, just looking around, killing time. Nobody paid particular attention to Ms. Patterson. She was the teacher. She could take care of herself. Michael Thornton, one of the students, was 16 years old that October afternoon. Skinny kid, curly dark hair, glasses that were slightly too big for his face. He'd been struggling in Sarah Patterson's history class, not because he wasn't smart, but because he didn't see the point in memorizing dates and names of dead people. The field trip was supposed to help with that, make history feel real instead of just words in a textbook. Michael stood near the bus with a couple friends, talking about nothing important: music, girls, plans for Halloween coming up in a few weeks. He saw Ms. Patterson walk past them toward the visitor center. She had her hands in her jacket pockets, seemed lost in thought, didn't really acknowledge the students nearby. Michael remembered thinking she looked tired. Teaching 42 teenagers for 2 straight days would exhaust anyone. He watched her reach the visitor center door, pull it open, step inside. That was the last time Michael Thornton saw his history teacher alive, though he wouldn't know that for 42 years. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Students started drifting back to the bus, ready to continue the trip. The parent chaperones did head counts, made sure everyone was accounted for. 42 students, check. But no Ms. Patterson. Tom Wilson noticed it around 2:45 p.m., 15 minutes after they'd stopped. He picked up the note from the dashboard, read it again. Back in 5 minutes. Well, it had been 15. Maybe she'd gotten delayed, run into someone she knew, lost track of time. By 3:00 p.m., Tom was getting concerned. He walked to the visitor center, pushed open the door. Inside was a small room with brochures about Wisconsin attractions, a couple of vending machines, a payphone on the wall. Empty. Nobody there. He called out, "Ms. Patterson, you in here?" Silence. Tom checked the women's restroom building, standing outside and calling in rather than entering. Mrs. Henderson, one of the parent chaperones, went inside to check. Empty. They searched the entire rest area, all the buildings around the picnic tables, even calling into the forest at the parking lot's edge in case Sarah had wandered off for some reason. Nothing. The other vehicles that had been in the parking lot when they'd arrived had left. New vehicles had arrived, a couple passing through, an RV with an elderly couple. Tom approached them, asked if anyone had seen a woman in a brown jacket, late 20s, brown hair, about 5'6". Nobody had noticed anything. By 3:30 p.m., genuine panic was setting in. Students sensed something was wrong. They gathered near the bus, quiet now, watching Tom and the parent chaperones search increasingly frantically. Michael Thornton felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. Teachers didn't just disappear. There had to be an explanation. Maybe she'd gotten a ride with someone back to town for an emergency. Maybe she'd called someone to come get her. Maybe there was a logical reason she'd broken her 5-minute promise. But there wasn't a logical reason. At 4:00 p.m., Tom Wilson used the payphone at the visitor center to call Jefferson High School's principal, explaining the situation. By 5:00 p.m., local sheriff's deputies had arrived. By 6:00 p.m., a full-scale search was underway. And by nightfall, when the charter bus finally returned to Jefferson High School without their history teacher, 42 students understood they'd witnessed something impossible. Someone had vanished in broad daylight from a location with dozens of potential witnesses, leaving nothing behind except a 5-minute promise that would remain unfulfilled for the rest of their lives. The mystery of what happened during those 5 minutes would consume the next 4 decades. And the answer, when it finally came, would arrive from a source nobody could have predicted, a grandfather's guilty conscience, documented in a journal he'd never intended anyone to read. Sarah Elizabeth Patterson was born in 1950 in the small Wisconsin town of Viroqua, population barely 3,000. Her father worked as a mechanic at the local John Deere dealership. Her mother cleaned houses and took in sewing to supplement the family income. They weren't poor, exactly, but money was always tight in ways that made Sarah conscious of what things cost, what opportunities required sacrifice. She grew up understanding that education was the path not out of Wisconsin, necessarily, but out of the limitations that came with being working class in a small town where most people's futures were predetermined by their parents' occupations. In 8th grade, Sarah had a history teacher named Mr. Robert Hendricks who changed everything. Most teachers at Viroqua Middle School treated history as memorization dates, battles, presidents in order. But Hendricks made it come alive. He brought in his own grandfather who'd fought in World War I. Let the old man tell stories about trenches in France that made the war feel real instead of just facts in a chapter. He organized a mock constitutional convention where students had to debate from the perspectives of different founding fathers, argue about slavery and states' rights and federalism. Sarah remembered feeling for the first time that the past wasn't dead. It was still here, still affecting everything, still relevant. She decided that day age 13, sitting in Hendricks's classroom, that she wanted to do for other kids what he'd done for her. Make history matter. Show students that understanding where they came from helped them figure out where they were going. It wasn't a particularly original dream, but it was hers, and she pursued it with the kind of quiet determination that defined her personality. Sarah attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison on a combination of scholarships and student loans. She worked 20 hours a week at the campus library to cover living expenses. She studied hard, got good grades, graduated in 1974 with a degree in history and a teaching certificate. The job market for teachers wasn't great that year. Budget cuts were hitting schools across Wisconsin, but Sarah got lucky. Jefferson High School, about 40 miles from her hometown, needed a history teacher. The pay wasn't much. The school itself was nothing special, typical rural high school serving farm communities and small towns. But it was a job, and Sarah took it. At 24, she was the youngest teacher on staff by nearly a decade. Some of the older teachers resented her initially, this young woman fresh out of college, with ideas about how things should be done differently. But Sarah won them over through sheer competence and genuine care for students. She showed up early, stayed late, took on extra duties without complaint. She didn't just teach her assigned classes. She started a history club that met after school. She helped coach the debate team. She volunteered to chaperone dances and sporting events. But what really set Sarah apart was how she taught. She didn't rely on textbooks and lectures. She brought in primary sources, Actual letters written by Civil War soldiers, newspaper articles from the Great Depression, photographs from different eras that students could analyze and discuss. She organized debates where students had to argue different sides of historical controversies. She made them write from perspectives other than their own. Imagine you're a Native American watching settlers arrive. Imagine you're a factory worker during the Industrial Revolution. Imagine you're a woman fighting for the right to vote. Former students would remember her decades later with the kind of specificity that indicated genuine impact. Ms. Patterson made me care about the Constitutional Convention, one would recall. I was a farm kid who thought history was boring, but she had us recreate the debates, and suddenly I understood why those arguments mattered. I got it. Another remembered, she never talked down to us. She treated us like we were capable of understanding complex things, and because she believed we could, we did. By 1979, Sarah had been teaching for 5 years. She was 29, still young enough to connect with teenagers, but experienced enough to command classroom respect. She'd started thinking about graduate school, maybe getting a master's degree in education or history. But that was future planning. Present reality was teaching 130 students spread across 5 classes, grading essays and tests, developing curriculum, and trying to make history feel alive for kids who often didn't see the point. The field trip idea had come to her during summer break in 1979. Wisconsin had incredible historical sites, but most of her students had never visited any of them. They lived an hour from Fort Crawford but had never seen it. They lived in a state with fascinating Native American history, but only knew it from textbook paragraphs. Sarah thought, what if instead of just reading about these places, students could actually go there, see them, touch them, experience history as something physical rather than abstract? She spent August developing the trip proposal, 3 days, mid-October when weather would still be decent, Fort Crawford to learn about frontier military history, State Capitol building to understand government structure, several museums documenting Native American culture, pioneer life, and Wisconsin's industrial development. Each site connected to specific curriculum requirements she had to meet. She calculated costs, researched hotels, mapped out an itinerary that would maximize educational value while staying within a budget that working-class families could afford. The school board approved her proposal in September, though some members questioned whether 3 days away from school was excessive. Sarah assured them the trip would accomplish more learning than 3 weeks of classroom lectures. She sent permission slips home, held a parent meeting, organized fundraising to help students whose families genuinely couldn't afford the $75 cost. By early October, she had 42 students signed up, almost her entire junior year history class. Day 1 of the trip was October 13, 1979. Students met at Jefferson High School at 6:30 a.m., sleepy but excited. The charter bus Tom Wilson drove pulled out at 7 a.m., heading southwest toward Prairie du Chien and Fort Crawford. Sarah sat near the front, going over her notes, making sure she had all the materials she'd prepared. The parent chaperones, Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Garcia, sat toward the back, theoretically keeping order, but mainly just making sure nobody did anything too stupid. Fort Crawford exceeded Sarah's hopes. The site wasn't fancy, partially reconstructed buildings, a small museum, costumed interpreters explaining frontier military life. But students engaged with it. They asked questions. They examined artifacts. They seemed genuinely interested in understanding what frontier soldiers' lives had been like. Sarah felt vindicated. This was working. This was what education should be. They checked into the Prairie du Chien Motel around 5 p.m., a budget place with questionable carpet and thin walls, but clean enough and affordable. Sarah had arranged for girls in some rooms, boys in others, adults strategically placed to supervise. They ate dinner at a nearby restaurant, students loud and energetic, but mostly well-behaved. By 10 p.m., everyone was supposed to be in their rooms, lights out. Sarah did bed checks, made sure no one was sneaking around, then collapsed in her own room, exhausted but satisfied. Day 1 had been a success. Day 2 started with breakfast at the motel's dining area, cereal and toast and orange juice that students complained about but ate anyway. They loaded onto the bus by 9 a.m., heading northeast toward Madison. Sarah had planned to reach the state capitol by early afternoon, tour tour it for a couple hours, then continued to their Madison hotel. The schedule was tight, but manageable. The bus ride was uneventful. Students talked, listened to portable radios playing whatever was popular, that Fall Blondie, the Eagles, the Doobie Brothers. Sarah reviewed her notes about the Capitol building, the tour she'd arranged, the specific architectural and historical details she wanted students to notice. Mr. Garcia dozed in his seat. Mrs. Henderson read a paperback novel. It was an ordinary moment on an ordinary trip that would become extraordinary only because of what happened next. When Tom Wilson mentioned around 2:15 p.m. that he needed to stop soon low on fuel, could use a bathroom break, Sarah had agreed without thinking much about it. Rest stops were normal. They'd been driving for hours. Students needed to stretch their legs. The Highway 35 rest area appeared perfectly adequate for a quick 15-minute pause before continuing to Madison. Sarah had written that note, "Back in 5 minutes, stay on the bus," because she wanted to check something in the visitor center, maybe grab a map to confirm their route, maybe use the payphone to call ahead to the Madison Hotel and verify their reservation. She'd had some vague administrative task in mind, something routine that would take just a few minutes. She stepped off the bus around 2:30 p.m., pulling her brown corduroy jacket tighter against the October chill. The rest area was quiet, just a few other vehicles in the parking lot, nobody around except her students and the chaperones. She walked toward the visitor center with her hands in her jacket pockets, thinking about the Capitol tour, about whether students would appreciate the building's architecture, about a million small details that teachers think about when they're responsible for 42 teenagers. She pulled open the visitor center door and stepped inside. The room was small and empty, just brochures and vending machines and that institutional smell of cleaning products and old carpet. And standing there, unexpected, was someone she recognized, someone she hadn't seen in over a year, someone whose presence at this random rest area seemed like impossible coincidence. Robert Thornton. Grandfather of David Thornton, the student Sarah had been forced to expel the previous spring after repeated disciplinary problems. The expulsion had been difficult. David had potential, but his behavior had become impossible to manage. Sarah had tried everything after-school meetings, behavior contracts, involving his parents and grandfather who was raising him. Nothing worked. David kept disrupting class, showing up late, being disrespectful in ways that undermined her authority. Finally, after David started a fight with another student in her classroom, Sarah had recommended expulsion. The school board had agreed. She'd heard through town gossip that David had spiraled after the expulsion, dropped out completely, started using drugs, got arrested for petty theft. And Robert Thornton, who'd raised David after the boy's parents died in a car accident, blamed Sarah Patterson for all of it. Blamed her for giving up on his grandson, for being too strict, for destroying the boy's future. Now, here was Robert Thornton, in a rest area in the middle of nowhere, and the look on his face wasn't coincidental. This wasn't chance. He'd followed the bus. He'd been waiting. And before Sarah could process what that meant, before she could back toward the door or call for help, Robert was talking voice low and angry, words tumbling out about his grandson, about Sarah's failures, about how teachers like her destroyed kids instead of helping them. Sarah tried to calm him, tried to explain, tried to edge toward the exit. But Robert was blocking the door now, and his anger was escalating, and those 5 minutes Sarah had promised were ticking away while something very wrong was happening in a visitor center that was supposed to be safe and routine. Outside, 42 students waited by the bus, completely unaware that their teacher was in danger, completely unaware that the next few minutes would change everything, completely unaware that they were about to spend the next 42 years trying to understand what happened during a rest stop that was supposed to be forgettable and ordinary. History, Sarah had always taught her students, was made of small moments that accumulated into something larger. She'd been right about that. But she never imagined her own small moment of rest stop, 5 minutes, a chance encounter would become the defining historical mystery of 42 people's lives. The first phone call to Sarah Patterson's parents came around 7 p.m. on October 14, 1979. Her father, Edward Patterson, answered. The Jefferson High School principal was on the line, his voice careful and controlled in that way adults use when they're trying not to cause panic while delivering terrible news. There had been an incident on the field trip. Sarah had gone missing from a rest stop. Law enforcement was involved. Search efforts were underway. Edward should come to the school immediately. Edward and his wife Dorothy arrived at Jefferson High around 8:30 p.m. to find a chaotic scene, parents picking up their confused and traumatized children, sheriff's deputies taking statements, the principal trying to manage competing demands for information. The Pattersons were ushered into an office where Detective William Morrison from the Vernon County Sheriff's Department explained what little was known. Their daughter had left a note saying she'd be back in 5 minutes. She'd walked toward the visitor center building. Nobody had seen her after that. Her purse was still on the bus. Her overnight bag was in the hotel where they'd stayed the previous night. She'd taken nothing with her except the brown corduroy jacket she'd been wearing. The initial assumption, the one that made the most sense to everyone except Sarah's parents, was voluntary disappearance. Maybe Sarah had been struggling with something, feeling overwhelmed, needed to get away. Maybe she'd hitchhiked somewhere, would call in a few days explaining everything. But Edward and Dorothy insisted that theory was nonsense. Sarah loved teaching. She'd been excited about the field trip. She wasn't the type to abandon responsibilities or worry people unnecessarily. Something bad had happened, something they needed to find her before it was too late. The search mobilized quickly. By the morning of October 15th, over 200 volunteers were combing the forests around the Highway 35 rest area. Search dogs tracked scents that led from the visitor center into the woods, but lost the trail after a couple hundred yards, suggesting either Sarah had been in a vehicle that left from that area, or something had happened that confused the dog's ability to track. Helicopters flew grid patterns overhead. Divers searched the nearby Kickapoo River. Abandoned buildings and caves received attention from teams who understood that bodies could be hidden in rural areas where wildlife and weather made evidence disappear quickly. Detective Morrison interviewed everyone who'd been at the rest area that afternoon. The family in the station wagon remembered seeing a charter bus but hadn't noticed anyone matching Sarah's description. The driver of the pickup truck had been sleeping in his vehicle and hadn't seen anything. The couple in the Illinois sedan had used the restrooms and left without interacting with anyone. None of the rest area employees, a maintenance worker who came by twice daily to clean the facilities, had been there during the relevant time frame. It was as if Sarah Patterson had walked into the visitor center and ceased to exist. The 42 students gave statements, but their accounts were frustratingly vague. Most remembered Ms. Patterson getting off the bus. A few had seen her walk toward the visitor center. Nobody recalled anything unusual. No strange vehicles arriving, no people who seemed out of place, no sounds of distress or struggle. Michael Thornton, when interviewed by Detective Morrison, tried hard to remember useful details. He'd seen Ms. Patterson walk past him toward the visitor center. She'd had her hands in her jacket pockets. She'd looked tired, but not scared. She'd pulled open the visitor center door and gone inside. That was it. That was all Michael had. Tom Wilson, the bus driver, was questioned extensively. Had he noticed any vehicles following the bus? Had anyone seemed to be paying particular attention to their route? Tom couldn't recall anything suspicious. The trip had been ordinary until it wasn't. The investigation consumed thousands of hours over the next 6 months. Morrison worked the case obsessively, convinced that answers existed if he could just find the right angle. He investigated Sarah's personal life, looking for jealous ex-boyfriends or financial problems or any indication she might have enemies. He found nothing. She dated occasionally but had no serious relationship. Her finances were typical for a young teacher, modest salary, student loan debt, nothing unusual. Her colleagues described her as dedicated and well-liked. Her students, even ones who'd struggled in her class, spoke about her with respect. The one lead that seemed potentially significant involved David Thornton, the student Sarah had been instrumental in expelling the previous spring. Morrison interviewed David, who was by then 17 and in obvious trouble thin, strung out on drugs, living in a rundown apartment and supporting himself through petty theft. David admitted he'd been angry about the expulsion, admitted he'd said things about Ms. Patterson that he regretted, but insisted he'd had nothing to do with her disappearance. He'd been in Jefferson the day she vanished, had witnesses who could confirm it. Morrison checked the alibi. It held. David hadn't been anywhere near that rest area. Morrison also interviewed David's grandfather, Robert Thornton. The old man was 73 in 1979, a retired carpenter living on Social Security in a small house on the outskirts of town. Robert expressed sympathy about Ms. Patterson's disappearance, but claimed no knowledge beyond what he'd read in newspapers. Morrison didn't press hard. Robert was clearly devoted to his troubled grandson, but he was also an elderly man with no history of violence, no apparent motive, and no connection to the events of October 14th beyond the coincidental fact that his grandson had once been Sarah's student. By spring 1980, the case had gone cold. Morrison had exhausted every lead, interviewed everyone even tangentially connected, found nothing that advanced the investigation. Sarah Patterson remained missing. No body had been found. No evidence of foul play had emerged. The case officially transitioned to inactive status in 1982, 3 years after the disappearance, though Morrison kept working it whenever he had spare time until his retirement in 1985. Edward and Dorothy Patterson never recovered from their daughter's disappearance. Dorothy died in 1987, effectively giving up after 8 years without answers. Edward lived until 1995, maintaining a quiet hope that somehow, someday, he'd learn what happened to Sarah. He never did. Both parents died without knowing that the answer to their daughter's disappearance had been less than a mile from their home the entire time, hidden in a journal Robert Thornton kept in his attic, written in shaky handwriting that documented guilt he could share with no one. The 42 students, meanwhile, grew up carrying the weight of that October afternoon in ways that shaped their adult lives. Some tried to forget, to move past it, to treat it as a tragedy that couldn't be solved and therefore shouldn't be dwelled upon. But others couldn't let it go. The impossibility of Ms. Patterson's disappearance gnawed at them. How had she vanished with so many witnesses nearby? Where had she gone? What had happened during those 5 minutes? In 1995, when most of the former students were in their early 30s, 6 of them formed what they called the Patterson Investigation Committee. It started informally, a reunion gathering where they discovered they'd all been thinking about the case, all frustrated by its unresolved status. Jennifer Walsh, who'd become a lawyer, suggested they could pool resources and hire a private investigator. Michael Thornton, working as an accountant, offered to manage the fund. David Chen, who'd gone into computer science, proposed creating a website to document everything known about the case. They started small, collecting $20 per person from anyone interested in contributing. The initial fund totaled $840, 42 students times $20. It wasn't much, but it was enough to hire a retired detective for a week's worth of investigation. That detective found nothing new, but the effort felt meaningful. They were doing something instead of just waiting for law enforcement to solve a case that had been cold for 16 years. The committee formalized over the next decade. They created a website primitive by modern standards, but functional, that documented the timeline, shared witness accounts, and asked anyone with information to come forward. They organized annual gatherings on October 14th, meeting at Jefferson High School to remember Ms. Patterson and share updates on investigation efforts. They hired private investigators periodically, usually retired law enforcement officers willing to review the case with fresh eyes. Most found nothing useful, but occasionally someone would uncover a small detail that hadn't been in the original police reports. By 2005, the committee had spent over $50,000 on investigation efforts. Some former students had contributed thousands personally. Others gave smaller amounts but stayed involved through the website and annual meetings. The dedication was remarkable. People who'd been scattered across the country by careers and life circumstances, staying connected through a shared commitment to solving a mystery from their teenage years. The emotional toll was significant. Spouses sometimes struggled to understand why their partners remained so invested in a case from decades earlier. Some committee members dealt with accusations of obsession, of being unable to move on, of wasting money and energy on something that would never be solved. But they persisted, driven by loyalty to a teacher who'd cared about them when they were teenagers, by guilt over not somehow preventing her disappearance, by the fundamental unfairness of someone vanishing without explanation. Michael Thornton was one of the most dedicated committee members. He'd felt personal responsibility since that October afternoon when he'd watched Ms. Patterson walk toward the visitor center and done nothing. He attended every annual gathering. He contributed financially beyond what his accountant's salary easily allowed. He spent hours on the website, updating information, responding to tips that came in from people who'd heard about the case. His wife Karen sometimes wondered if Michael was more married to the investigation than to her, but she tolerated it, because she understood he needed this, needed to feel like he was doing something useful, like Ms. Patterson's disappearance wouldn't be forgotten just because official investigations had failed. Michael's relationship with his grandfather Robert had always been close. Robert had helped raise Michael after Michael's parents divorced when he was 12. Robert had attended Michael's high school graduation, his college graduation, his wedding. When Michael's own children were born, Robert was there as great-grandfather, delighted to see the family line continue. Robert died in 2019 at age 93, having lived a long life that seemed, from the outside, unremarkable. A retired carpenter who'd raised a troubled grandson, weathered family difficulties, and quietly faded into elderly obscurity. Michael inherited Robert's house after the old man's death. The small place where Robert had lived for 50 years needed to be cleaned out, sorted through, prepared for sale. It was emotionally difficult work going through a lifetime of accumulated possessions, deciding what had value and what was just junk that needed disposal. Michael tackled it gradually over months, usually on weekends when he could recruit his teenage son to help carry heavy items. In March 2021, Michael and his son were clearing out the attic, a cramped, dusty space filled with boxes that hadn't been opened in decades. Old tools, Christmas decorations, photograph albums documenting family history. And in a corner, hidden behind insulation, a wooden box Michael didn't recognize. He pulled it out, opened it, found a leather-bound journal inside. The journal was old, the pages yellowed and brittle. Michael opened it carefully and saw his grandfather's handwriting familiar from birthday cards and Christmas notes. The first entry was dated October 15, 1979, the day after Ms. Patterson disappeared. Michael's hands started shaking as he read the first paragraph. "I've done something terrible, something I can never take back. That teacher, the one who ruined David's life, I confronted her yesterday at a rest area. I didn't plan to hurt her. I just wanted her to understand what she'd done. But she tried to leave, tried to get away from me, and I grabbed her arm, and she fell and hit her head, and then she wasn't moving anymore." Michael sat on the attic floor, journal in his trembling hands, reading his grandfather's confession to a murder that had haunted him for 42 years. Reading details about where Robert had hidden the body, a location less than a mile from where Michael sat. Reading Robert's justifications and rationalizations and guilt. Reading 42 years of secret shame that Robert had carried alone, unable to confess but unable to forget. Michael's son asked what was wrong. Michael couldn't answer, couldn't speak, could only sit there processing the impossible reality. His grandfather, the man who'd helped raise him, who'd been kind and supportive and present throughout Michael's entire life, had killed Ms. Patterson, had killed the teacher whose disappearance had shaped Michael's adult life, had killed her and hidden the body and stayed silent for 42 years while Michael spent thousands of dollars and countless hours trying to solve a mystery Robert could have resolved with a single conversation. Michael faced a choice that nobody should have to make. Protect his grandfather's reputation. The man was dead, couldn't be prosecuted. Revealing the truth would destroy the family's memory of him. Or honor Ms. Patterson, give her family the answers they'd died without receiving, give his fellow students the resolution they'd spent decades seeking, bring truth to light regardless of cost. The choice, really, was no choice at all. Michael called Detective Sarah Chen with the Wisconsin State Police Cold Case Unit the next morning. His voice was steady but strained. He had information about the Sarah Patterson case from 1979, information nobody was going to want to hear. Detective Sarah Chen had worked cold cases for 12 years, long enough to recognize when someone's voice carried the weight of genuine revelation rather than another dead-end tip. Michael Thornton's phone call on March 17, 2021, had that quality, hesitant but resolute, the sound of someone who'd discovered something they wished they could unknow. Chen arranged to meet Michael at the state police barracks in La Crosse that afternoon, bringing along her partner, Detective James Rodriguez, and a digital recorder for documenting whatever Michael had found. Michael arrived at 2:00 p.m., carrying a banker's box containing the journal and several other items from his grandfather's attic. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept since discovering the journal 3 days earlier. Chen led him to an interview room. Institutional gray walls, fluorescent lighting, the kind of space designed for function rather than comfort. Michael placed the box on the table between them and just sat there for a moment, gathering himself. "I need to tell you something about my grandfather," Michael finally said. "Robert Thornton. He died 2 years ago at 93. I loved him. He helped raise me when my parents divorced. He was at every important moment of my life, graduations, my wedding, my kids' births. He was a good man." Michael paused, correcting himself. "I thought he was a good man, but I found something in his attic that changes everything." Chen waited, letting Michael tell it at his own pace. Rushing people who were about to reveal family secrets never worked. Michael pulled the leather journal from the box and slid it across the table. "This is his handwriting. I've seen it thousands of times. These are his words. And according to what's written here, my grandfather killed Sarah Patterson in October 1979. The room went very quiet. Chen had worked the Patterson case, one of Wisconsin's most baffling disappearances, 42 years old with no breaks, no resolution. She'd reviewed the file when she'd joined the cold case unit, added it to her mental list of cases she hoped to solve, but probably never would. And now this man, himself one of the 42 student witnesses from that October afternoon, was saying his grandfather had confessed in a journal nobody knew existed. Chen put on gloves before touching the journal. Evidence handling protocol even for something this old. She opened it carefully, saw the date October 15th, 1979, and began reading. The handwriting was shaky, words sometimes crossed out and rewritten, the penmanship of someone writing under emotional duress. But the content was unmistakable. Robert Thornton had confronted Sarah Patterson at the Highway 35 rest area, had followed the charter bus from Jefferson, waiting for an opportunity, had seen Sarah enter the visitor center alone and seized his chance. The journal entry described their confrontation, Robert demanding Sarah explain why she'd destroyed David's life, Sarah trying to remain calm, trying to explain that the expulsion had been necessary after repeated disciplinary problems. Robert becoming angrier, blocking the door, accusing Sarah of giving up on his grandson. Sarah attempting to leave, to get back to her students. Robert grabbing her arm to stop her. Sarah pulling away, losing her balance, falling and hitting her head against the corner of a vending machine. Robert had written that he'd panicked, checked for a pulse and found none, realized Sarah was dead and that he'd killed her, however accidentally. Realized he was 73 years old, would spend whatever time he had left in prison if anyone discovered what happened. Realized nobody had witnessed the confrontation. They'd been alone in the visitor center. The students were outside near the bus. Nobody had seen him arrive because he'd parked his truck at the far edge of the rest area parking lot. The journal detailed what Robert did next with a precision that turned Chen's stomach. He'd waited until the visitor center was clear, just a few minutes until the maintenance worker who'd been in the bathroom building left. Then, Robert had carried Sarah's body to his truck, wrapped in a tarp he kept in the truck bed for hauling construction debris. He'd driven less than a mile down a dirt logging road that intersected Highway 35, pulled deep into the forest where hunters occasionally went, but nobody lived. Using a shovel from his truck, he dug a grave in soft earth near a fallen oak tree, buried Sarah, covered the grave with leaves and forest debris, and driven away. The entire process had taken maybe 90 minutes. By the time search efforts began that evening, Sarah had already been in the ground for hours. Robert had gone home, cleaned his truck, burned the tarp in his wood stove, and tried to convince himself he could live with what he'd done. The journal documented his struggle with that conviction. Entries continued sporadically over the next 42 years, Robert writing when guilt became overwhelming, when he needed to confess, even if only to paper that nobody would read. October 14th, 1980, 1-year anniversary. I dream about her sometimes, about that moment when she fell. I didn't mean to kill her, I just wanted her to understand. But David is gone now too. The drugs took him before he even turned 25. So what was the point? I destroyed 2 lives trying to protect one that couldn't be saved. October 14th, 1985, 6 years. I see her students holding those memorial services every year. I drive past Jefferson High on the anniversary. They still remember her. They're still trying to find her. If I told them where to look, it would take 20 minutes, but I can't. I won't spend whatever time I have left in prison. That's not how this ends. October 14th, 1995, 16 years. Michael is working on that investigation committee now. My own grandson, spending money and time trying to solve something I could explain in 5 minutes. The irony would be funny if it wasn't so heartbreaking. He talks to me about the case sometimes, asks if I have any theories. I tell him I don't know, that it's a mystery. And he believes me, because why wouldn't he? Grandfathers don't lie to grandsons about murder. The entries went on. Robert had written every year on October 14th, his private ritual of guilt and justification and self-recrimination. The final entry was dated October 14th, 2018, 1 year before his death. I'm 92 years old. I probably don't have much time left. Part of me wants to confess, to let Sarah's family know what happened, to give those students the answers they've spent their entire adult lives seeking. But I'm too much of a coward. I'll take this secret to my grave and let them keep wondering. Maybe after I'm gone, someone will find this journal. Maybe then the truth will come out, or maybe this journal gets thrown away with all the other junk accumulated over a lifetime, and the secret dies with me. Either way, I won't be here to face the consequences. That's the coward's way out. But it's the only way I have. Chen finished reading and looked up at Michael, who'd been sitting silently while she processed the journal's contents. This location, he describes the logging road, the fallen oak tree. Do you know where that is? Michael nodded. I think so. I drove around that area after reading the journal, trying to match his description to actual terrain. There's a logging road about a mile south of where the rest area used to be. It's been decommissioned for years, barely passable now. If you go about half a mile in, there's an area with several large oaks. One of them fell probably in a storm decades ago. It's overgrown now, but the basic geography matches what he described. Chen asked the obvious question. Why are you bringing this to us? Your grandfather is dead. He can't be prosecuted. You could have destroyed the journal and nobody would ever know. Michael had clearly anticipated this question. Because Ms. Patterson's family deserves answers. Because the people I went to high school with, people who've spent 42 years wondering what happened, deserve to know. Because keeping this secret would make me complicit in covering up murder. My grandfather was important to me, but that doesn't mean I protect what he did. He made his choices. Now I'm making mine. Chen started the formal process. The journal was logged as evidence. Michael gave a detailed statement about finding it, about his grandfather's life and habits, about everything he knew that might be relevant. Chen contacted the Vernon County Sheriff's Department, which still had jurisdiction over the original disappearance case. She assembled a team forensic anthropologists from the state crime lab, cadaver dogs, technicians trained in excavating burial sites that had been undisturbed for decades. On March 20, 2021, the team descended on the location Michael had identified. The logging road was indeed barely passable, overgrown with brush, washed out in sections, clearly unused for years. They drove as far as they could in four-wheel drive vehicles, then hiked the rest of the way carrying equipment. The fallen oak tree was where Michael had said it would be, a massive trunk covered in moss and surrounded by undergrowth that had accumulated over 40-plus years. The cadaver dogs alerted in an area about 15 feet from the fallen tree. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed an anomaly in the soil, something that didn't match the surrounding Earth's density. The forensic team began careful excavation, removing layers of forest debris and topsoil with the methodical patience their work required. 3 feet down, they found what they'd been looking for. Skeletal remains, partially wrapped in deteriorated fabric that might once have been clothing. The bones were arranged in a way consistent with burial rather than natural deposition. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the forensic anthropologist leading the excavation, carefully documented everything in situ before removing remains for transport to the state crime lab. Dental records would provide definitive identification, But the location, the circumstances, the timing, everything pointed toward these being Sarah Patterson's remains. The 42-year search was over. The mystery had finally been solved, and the answer had been less than a mile from the rest area where students had waited for a teacher who'd promised to return in 5 minutes. The dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains belonged to Sarah Elizabeth Patterson, missing since October 14, 1979. Forensic analysis revealed a fractured skull consistent with falling and striking a hard surface, exactly as Robert Thornton's journal had described. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Whether Robert had pushed her or she'd simply lost balance while trying to escape his grip was impossible to determine from skeletal evidence alone. But the result was the same. Sarah Patterson had died in that visitor center, and Robert Thornton had buried her in the woods to avoid accountability. Chen called Michael with the confirmation. He'd been waiting for it, knowing it was coming, but somehow still hoping the journal had been fiction, that his grandfather hadn't really done what he'd confessed to doing. The confirmation destroyed that last fragile hope. Michael's grandfather, the man who'd taught him to fish, who'd helped him build a treehouse when he was 10, who'd been present and supportive through Michael's entire life, was a murderer who'd spent 42 years lying to everyone, including the grandson who'd devoted decades to solving the crime Robert himself had committed. The news went public on March 25, 2021. Local media picked it up first, then regional, then national true crime outlets that covered cold cases. The Patterson Investigation Committee, still active after all these years, still meeting annually, still maintaining their website, learned about the resolution through a phone call from Chen. She wanted them to hear it from her rather than from news reports, wanted to acknowledge that their dedication, while it hadn't directly solved the case, had kept Sarah Patterson's memory alive in ways that mattered. The committee members, 42 former students now in their late 50s, processed the news in different ways. Some felt vindication. They'd been right that Sarah hadn't left voluntarily, right that something terrible had happened, right to never stop searching. Others felt anger at Robert Thornton for killing their teacher, and then watching them spend decades and thousands of dollars investigating a crime he could have solved with a phone call. A few felt complicated sympathy for Michael, who'd lost not just his grandfather, but his memory of his grandfather, who now had to reconcile the man who'd been kind to him with the man who'd committed murder and hidden it through decades of calculated deception. Jennifer Walsh, the lawyer who'd helped establish the committee, spoke to reporters about the resolution. "We spent 42 years wondering what happened to Ms. Patterson, wondering if she was alive somewhere, if she'd had amnesia, if she'd been abducted, if she'd met with some accident. The truth is somehow both more mundane and more devastating than anything we imagined. A confrontation that turned violent, a cover-up that succeeded because nobody suspected an elderly man whose only connection to Sarah was through a grandson she'd taught. We're grateful to finally have answers, but we're heartbroken that Sarah died the way she did, trying to do her job, trying to handle a difficult situation, killed essentially for being a conscientious teacher who enforced reasonable discipline." The committee organized a memorial service for Sarah, 42 years after her death. It was held at Jefferson High School, where Sarah had taught and where the field trip had originated. Former students attended many of them, though not all 42. Time and geography and life circumstances prevented some from making the trip. But enough came that the auditorium felt full. They shared memories of Sarah Patterson, her teaching methods, her passion for history, her genuine care for students. They mourned not just her death, but everything she'd been prevented from becoming, the students she'd never taught, the family she'd never built, the decades of life stolen from her by a man's anger and fear. Michael Thornton attended the memorial service, though he'd debated whether his presence would be welcome. Some former classmates embraced him, acknowledging the courage it took to come forward with evidence that destroyed his family's history. Others avoided him, unable to separate Michael from what his grandfather had done. Michael understood both reactions. He'd struggled with the same contradictions, knowing intellectually that he wasn't responsible for Robert's actions while feeling emotionally implicated by family connection. During the service, Michael was given an opportunity to speak. He stood at the podium, looking out at faces he'd known since childhood, and tried to find words adequate to the situation. "I didn't know," he finally said. "For 42 years, I didn't know my grandfather had killed Ms. Patterson. I spent decades trying to solve her disappearance, trying to honor her memory, never suspecting that the answer was in my own family. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't find the journal sooner. I'm sorry my grandfather did what he did. I'm sorry Ms. Patterson died trying to do her job, and I'm grateful, if that's even the right word, that the truth finally came out, that we finally have answers, even though those answers are painful." The students who'd been 16 in 1979 were 58 in 2021. They'd spent their entire adult lives haunted by an October afternoon when their teacher had disappeared in front of them. Now, finally, they knew what had happened, knew where Sarah had been all these years, knew that she hadn't abandoned them voluntarily, hadn't chosen to disappear, had simply been in the wrong place when an angry old man decided to confront her about a disciplinary decision that had been correct and necessary. Sarah Patterson was buried in Viroqua, Wisconsin, her hometown, in a cemetery where her parents were also buried. The funeral was small family members who'd never stopped mourning, former students paying their respects, community members who remembered the young teacher who'd vanished so mysteriously. The marker read simply, "Sarah Elizabeth Patterson, 1950-1979. Beloved teacher, daughter, friend. Found at last." The rest area where Sarah had disappeared no longer existed by 2021. It had been closed years earlier, deemed obsolete as highway travel patterns changed. The building had been demolished, the parking lot allowed to return to nature. But the site remained in the memories of everyone who'd been there that October afternoon, everyone who'd waited for a teacher who'd promised to return in 5 minutes and never did. The mystery had been solved. The truth had emerged, and a family secret had been brought to light by a man who understood that loyalty to the dead mattered less than justice for the victim whose life they'd stolen. The legal questions surrounding Robert Thornton's posthumous confession were complex and unprecedented in Wisconsin jurisprudence. The state couldn't prosecute a dead man, but the discovery of Sarah Patterson's remains and the detailed confession created obligations that extended beyond traditional criminal proceedings. The Vernon County District Attorney's Office convened in April 2021 to determine how to handle a case where the perpetrator had escaped earthly justice through the simple expedient of dying before his crime was discovered. District Attorney Rebecca Morrison. No relation to the original detective William Morrison, ultimately decided that while criminal charges were impossible, a formal inquest could establish the facts for the historical record. The inquest would examine the evidence, hear testimony, and render official findings about what had happened on October 14, 1979. It wouldn't result in punishment, but it would provide closure through acknowledgement of truth. The inquest convened in June 2021 at the Vernon County Courthouse. Michael Thornton was the primary witness, testifying about discovering the journal, about his grandfather's life and character, about the cognitive dissonance of learning that someone he'd loved and trusted was capable of murder. His testimony was steady but clearly painful, each detail about Robert's confession. Another cut into the memory of a relationship that had defined Michael's life. "My grandfather raised me after my parents divorced," Michael told the court. "He taught me to fish, to build things with my hands, to treat people with respect. He came to every basketball game I played in high school. He was at my college graduation, my wedding, the births of both my children. He was everything a grandfather should be, present, supportive, loving. And somehow he was also a man who killed someone and hid it for 42 years. I don't know how to reconcile those two versions of him. I don't think I ever will." The defense attorney appointed to represent Robert Thornton's interests, a legal formality in an inquest involving a deceased person, attempted to argue that the journal should be viewed with skepticism, that elderly people sometimes confess to things they didn't do, that Robert might have been suffering from dementia or fabricating guilt over some perceived connection to Sarah's disappearance. But the evidence was overwhelming. The body had been found exactly where Robert described. The manner of death matched his account. Details in the journal that were never publicly released, like the specific location of the fallen oak tree, could only have been known by someone who'd been there. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the forensic anthropologist who'd excavated Sarah's remains, testified about the skeletal evidence. The fractured skull indicated a fall consistent with striking a hard edge. The burial location and method matched what Robert had described. In my professional opinion, Dr. Morrison testified, the journal's account of how Sarah Patterson died and where she was buried is consistent with all physical evidence we've recovered. Former Detective William Morrison, now 86 years old and long retired, attended the inquest as an observer. He'd worked Sarah Patterson's case for years, exhausted every lead he could think of, and ultimately failed to solve it. Sitting in the courtroom, listening to how close he'd actually been, Robert Thornton had been interviewed early in the investigation, had been dismissed as an elderly man with no apparent motive. Morrison felt the particular anguish of knowing he'd had the killer in front of him and let him walk away. During a break in proceedings, Morrison approached Michael Thornton in the courthouse hallway. The two men had never met before. Morrison had retired decades before Michael discovered the journal, but they shared a connection through Sarah Patterson's case. Morrison extended his hand. "Thank you for coming forward," he said. "I know it wasn't easy. I interviewed your grandfather in 1979. He seemed like a nice old man, grief-stricken about his grandson, worried about the missing teacher. I had no reason to suspect him. Nobody did. That's how he got away with it for 42 years. Michael shook Morrison's hand, feeling the weight of history in that simple gesture. The detective who'd tried to solve the case, the grandson who'd finally provided the answer, neither had wanted. "You did everything you could with what you had," Michael replied. "My grandfather was good at hiding things, good at seeming like someone he wasn't. You shouldn't blame yourself for not seeing through that." The inquest lasted 3 days. Testimony from multiple witnesses, presentation of physical evidence, examination of the journal and its contents. The findings, released on June 18, 2021, were unequivocal. Robert Thornton had killed Sarah Patterson on October 14, 1979, at the Highway 35 rest area. The death, while possibly not premeditated, was the direct result of Robert's decision to confront Sarah about his grandson's expulsion. Robert had then concealed the body and maintained a deception for 42 years, successfully evading justice through a combination of luck, careful planning, and the fundamental unlikelihood that an elderly man with no criminal history would be suspected of murdering a young teacher with whom he had only the most tangential connection. The findings brought official closure, but they also opened wounds that had partially healed over decades. David Thornton's story. The troubled student whose expulsion had triggered his grandfather's rage became tragically ironic in retrospect. David had died in 1984 at age 23, victim of a car accident while driving under the influence of drugs. His spiral after expulsion had been real and devastating. But Sarah Patterson's discipline hadn't caused it. She'd simply been the adult willing to enforce consequences when David's behavior became untenable. Robert Thornton had killed the wrong person for the wrong reason, and even he had eventually recognized that truth in his journal entries that acknowledged David's death made the murder pointless. The Thornton family, beyond Michael, struggled with the revelation. Michael's Aunt Robert's daughter issued a statement through her attorney expressing shock and grief at learning her father was a murderer. "The man I knew was kind and gentle," the statement read. "He was a loving father and grandfather. That he was capable of killing someone and hiding it for decades doesn't match anything I thought I knew about him. But evidence doesn't lie. My father killed Sarah Patterson. I'm deeply sorry for the pain he caused her family, her students, and everyone who spent years searching for answers he could have provided. I hope they can find some peace now that the truth is known." The Patterson family's response was complicated by the fact that Sarah's parents had both died without knowing what happened to their daughter. Sarah's younger brother, Thomas Patterson, was the only immediate family member still alive in 2021. He issued a brief statement thanking law enforcement, thanking Michael Thornton for coming forward, and expressing relief that his sister could finally be laid to rest with dignity. "We waited 42 years for answers," Thomas said. "Our parents died without knowing what happened to Sarah. I'm grateful the truth finally emerged, but I'm heartbroken it took so long and came from such an unexpected source. The former students of Jefferson High School's class of 1981, the 42, who'd been on that bus in October 1979, organized a final gathering in August 2021. They met at what remained of the Highway 35 rest area, now just a cleared space off the highway with no buildings or markers indicating what had once stood there. They came from across the country, some traveling hundreds of miles, to finally close a chapter that had been open for 42 years of their lives. Jennifer Walsh, who'd been instrumental in forming the Patterson Investigation Committee decades earlier, spoke to the group. "We spent our entire adult lives searching for Ms. Patterson. We spent thousands of dollars and countless hours trying to solve a mystery that one man could have explained in 5 minutes. We're standing here today because one person, Michael Thornton, chose truth over family loyalty, chose to honor our teacher over protecting his grandfather's reputation. That took courage most of us will never have to demonstrate. We're grateful to him, and we're grateful we finally have answers, even though those answers came from the most unlikely source imaginable." Michael had debated attending this gathering, uncertain whether his presence would be welcome among people whose lives had been shaped by his grandfather's crime. But Jennifer had called him personally, insisting he come, insisting the group wanted to thank him rather than blame him. So Michael stood among his former classmates, people he'd known since childhood, people he'd worked alongside on investigation efforts without ever knowing the answer was in his own family, and accepted their complicated gratitude. David Chen, who'd managed the investigation website for 26 years, announced the site would be archived but would remain online as a historical record. "This case taught us that some mysteries can be solved through dedication and refusal to give up," Chen said. "But it also taught us that sometimes answers come from completely unexpected places, that evidence can hide in plain sight for decades, and that the truth, when it finally emerges, is often more complex and painful than we imagined." The group shared memories of Sarah Patterson, not of her disappearance, but of her teaching. The field trip to Fort Crawford the day before she died, the way she'd made the Constitutional Convention feel relevant by having students debate from historical perspectives, the recommendations she'd written for college applications, the after-school help she'd provided without being asked. They remembered her as a complete person rather than just a victim, honored her for the teacher she'd been rather than reducing her to the tragedy of how she'd died. As the gathering concluded, the group planted a memorial tree at the edge of the old rest area, a young oak that would grow and mature in the decades ahead, a living marker for a teacher who died trying to do her job. The plaque read, "In memory of Sarah Elizabeth Patterson, 1950-1979. Teacher, friend, inspiration. Her students never forgot." Michael stood with the others as the tree was planted, thinking about memory and legacy and the impossible weight of family history. His grandfather had been dead for 2 years before the journal was discovered. Robert Thornton had escaped earthly justice, had lived to 93 without facing consequences for murder. But he'd also lived with the burden of guilt documented in those annual journal entries, the recognition that he'd killed someone for essentially no reason, that he'd destroyed lives including his own grandsons, through desperate attempts to conceal what he'd done. The question Michael kept returning to was whether Robert had been a good man who did one terrible thing, or a fundamentally bad man who'd successfully pretended to be good. The distinction mattered because it determined how Michael should remember his grandfather. With complicated forgiveness for a moment of violence that got out of control, or with recognition that the kindness Robert showed his family was performance, masking someone capable of murder and decades of calculated deception. Michael never resolved that question to his own satisfaction. Human nature, he concluded, was more complicated than simple categories of good and bad allowed. Robert Thornton had been a loving grandfather and a murderer, had been supportive and deceptive, had been present and absent in ways that couldn't be reconciled into a coherent narrative. Michael learned to live with that ambiguity because he had no other choice. The grandfather who'd raised him and the grandfather who'd killed Sarah Patterson were the same person, and Michael would spend the rest of his life trying to understand how both could be true. The legal proceedings concluded with no criminal charges, impossible when the accused was dead, but with official acknowledgement of what had happened. Sarah Patterson had been murdered by Robert Thornton on October 14, 1979. The case was officially closed, the mystery solved, the 42-year search finally over. The broader lessons from Sarah Patterson's case resonated through cold case investigation communities nationwide. The case demonstrated that answers sometimes came from completely unexpected sources: family journals, deathbed confessions, discoveries made while cleaning out a relative's house decades after the crime. It showed that evidence could survive in forms nobody anticipated, that secrets could be maintained for lifetimes, and that justice sometimes required painful choices about loyalty and truth. For the 42 former students who'd spent their adult lives searching for their teacher, the resolution brought complicated closure. They'd been right to never give up, right to believe Sarah hadn't left voluntarily, right to invest time and money in investigation efforts that kept her memory alive and demonstrated that she mattered, that her disappearance wasn't acceptable, that some absences demanded explanation regardless of how much time passed. But they had also been wrong about certain things. They had imagined stranger abduction, serial killers, elaborate conspiracies. The truth was more mundane: an angry grandfather confronting a teacher about a disciplinary decision that had been correct and necessary. Violence that erupted not from premeditation, but from a tense situation that escalated beyond control. A cover-up that succeeded because nobody suspected the perpetrator. Sarah Patterson's story became a reminder that victims deserved to be remembered, that families deserved answers, that cold cases could be solved decades after they went cold, but also that resolution sometimes came at costs nobody anticipated. Michael Thornton had given the former students and Sarah's family the answers they'd sought for 42 years. But he'd lost his grandfather in the process, not to death, which had already happened, but to knowledge that destroyed the memory of their relationship. The final memorial service was held in October 2021, on the 42nd anniversary of Sarah's disappearance. The service took place at her grave in Viroqua, where she was finally buried next to the parents who died without knowing what happened to their daughter. Former students attended, law enforcement officers who'd worked the case, community members who remembered the young teacher who'd vanished so mysteriously, and Michael Thornton, who'd solved the case nobody else could solve by discovering the truth in his own family's history. As the service concluded and people began to leave, Michael remained at the grave for a few extra minutes. He didn't pray, wasn't sure what he'd say if he tried. Just stood there thinking about Sarah Patterson, about his grandfather, about the way one violent afternoon in 1979 had rippled through decades, affecting dozens of lives in ways nobody could have predicted. Finally, Michael spoke quietly to the gravestone. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what my grandfather did. I'm sorry it took 42 years to find you. I'm sorry your students had to spend their lives searching instead of just remembering. You deserved better. They deserved better. I hope this helps somehow. I hope you're at peace." He walked back to his car, joining the line of vehicles leaving the cemetery. Behind him, Sarah Patterson's grave was marked now, no longer a missing person, no longer a mystery, just a teacher who died too young trying to do her job. The 42 students who'd watched her walk toward a rest area building in October 1979 could finally let her go, could remember her without the desperate need to solve her disappearance, could honor her memory without the weight of unanswered questions. The case of Sarah Patterson was closed. The truth had emerged. And Michael Thornton, who'd made an impossible choice between family and justice, could carry forward knowing he'd done the right thing, even though doing the right thing had cost him the memory of someone he'd loved. Some secrets he'd learned were too important to keep. Some truths mattered more than comfort, and sometimes the hardest thing to do was also the only thing that could be done. Justice had arrived 42 years late, but it had arrived, and that, in the end, had to be enough.